Suchetana Ray and she will come and introduce the panelists, and the first panel will come in. Suchetana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alokeshda. Hello, everyone. I'm Suchetana Ray, Senior Assistant Editor with the Economic Times. And it gives me immense pleasure to welcome all of you to the first panel discussion as well as to advantEDge. We have very exciting panels lined up. I'll begin with the first panel where we will discuss rewiring India's education system. We have a very strong panelist lineup, and let me start with introducing my panelists. First, Ramanathan Ramanan. He's the Mission Director, Atal Innovation Mission, and Additional Secretary, Niti Aayog. Sir, welcome and thank you for taking the time out. I have Professor Anil Sahasrabudhe, Chairman AICTE, and I also have Professor Rajendra Srivastava, Dean and Novartis Professor of Marketing, Strategy and Innovation, Indian School of Business. We also have Professor Anju Seth, Director, IIM Calcutta. We have Professor Dr. C. Kumar. He's the Professor and Vice Chancellor, OP Jindal Global University. With him, we have Narayanan Ramaswamy, National Leader, Education and Skill Development, KPMG, and Phalgun Kompalli, co-founder of ET-upGrad. Thanks to all of you for taking the time out and joining me. Thank you very much once again. And I hope that we'll have a very strong debate. We all know the problems with our education system, so let me not bore you with them once again. But now a document in the form of the National Education Policy 2020 promises to change it fundamentally. However, from promise to fulfillment is mostly a very long journey in India, as we all know. And among many other salient points, what gives people a lot of hope is that the NEP focuses on vocational learning. It promises a catch up with technology such as AI, etc. There is a thrust on online learning. There is also a promise of increasing the budgetary allocation to education to a significant percentage of the GDP. But like with any other document like the NEP, doubts are being raised about its effective implementation. So let's hear from our eminent panelists if this document can truly rewire the Indian education system. I'll begin this panel with a question which I will ask all of you. That is, we'll begin with quick takes on the national education policy. What are your thoughts about it? Do you think that India has the money, that's the budget and the infrastructure to implement something like the NEP? Do we have the resources and as well as the teaching faculty to support it? I'll go to Mr. Ramanathan first.
Thank you, Suchetana, and good morning to everybody and the distinguished panel who are there. It's indeed a pleasure and privilege to be participating in this discussion, which should be a very important and a national discussion that has to be held in different quarters of the country. And the topic is learn to relearn. No other time has been as important as now for us to learn to relearn. And what is from learn to relearn? What do we have to relearn? First and foremost, we have had a rote learning mindset in our schools and our universities, in our colleges, where we have been encouraged to get good marks, get into a good school, get into a good university, get into a good job. And we have done remarkably well in that. We have a $191 billion IT/ITES industry that has sprung up because of our focus on education and rote learning. But what has brought us here is not going to get us to the next level. And therefore, it is very important for us to relearn how we are going to convert and transform the mindset that is prevalent from a rote learning mindset to a problem-solving, innovative mindset that our country needs. The second important thing that learn to relearn is how do you create an ecosystem of entrepreneurship and innovation in our country and convert not just from a nation of job seekers, but also of job creators. We have 1.3 billion people in our country. We have 1.4 million schools. We have 10,500 engineering and related institutions. We have 39,000 colleges, and we have 150 million young students entering into the workplace. If we are not able to address this very important demographic dividend, which is the envy of many a country, and be able to transform to a problem-solving, innovative mindset, to skills that are relevant to the modern age, skills like 3D printing, robotics, IoT, miniaturized electronics, augmented virtual reality, that is sweeping the marketplace and is changing the way solutions are being created. And if we do not create a nation of job creators versus just a nation of job seekers, we are going to do a big disservice to our demographic dividend. And that is why this particular learn to relearn and the new education policy, which is actually positioning us to meet on all these particular aspects, is so very important. And my take is that this is one of the most game-changing, revolutionary redrafting of our educational policy, which is going to help India not only grow up in its global innovation index. It has grown from 81 to 48 in just in the last 5 years. How do we go into the global top 10? And that will require this new education policy to really take root and be implemented in a very successful manner.
Thank you very much, sir. I'll take this question to Professor Sahasrabudhe. Mr. Ramanan spoke about the catch-up that Indian education needs to do with technology. The oft-repeated complaint, sir, is the outcomes gap. Students are not job ready. So how can we maintain the balance between, general education and skill development, which is based on market's need?
I think national education policy announced on 29th of July is certainly a transformative and game-changing policy. The reason is right from primary education, from class 6th, there is emphasis on building skills. It may be skills which are based on motor skills, maybe welding or carpentry on one side, or even programming skills to artificial intelligence skills being taught to the students right from age of around 10, 12 itself. They will be fully prepared when they come to the higher education. So that is what is going to happen in the immediate future. Coming to the higher education per se itself, AICTE in the last 3 years has started many reforms which are seeing the fruits of that particular policy change which we started doing before the policy itself was announced. Starting from whether it is curriculum revision at regular intervals, faculty training programs under faculty development program called Atal Academies in AI, IoT, machine learning, 3D printing, robotics, cloud computing, cyber security, AR, VR, data science, and all these issues, including some of the topics of civil engineering or mechanical engineering, like, for example, whether it is environmental science or whether it is geotechnical engineering, all of those are being trained to the faculty members. And fortunately, you talked also about online education, and which UpGrad and many other organizations have been doing. AICTE, MHRD, then now Ministry of Education, have a portal called NEET, National Educational Alliance for Technology. And UpGrad is also one of the agencies, which is one of the companies which is onboarded onto that. And these are all AI-based personalized learning tools which are available for students at a small cost. So apart from their regular curriculum, we have been providing opportunities for students to take up those type of courses, which are very short in duration, maybe 3 months, 6 months, but in the process, they will get empowered. And therefore, new education policy, while taking care of education, empowerment, entrepreneurship development, I think is going to be certainly a game-changing exercise that is going to happen. And as well, let us not be too much worried about what is the budget available. Certainly, government is providing large chunk of budget for doing this. But in terms of infrastructure, immediate actions are being initiated. For example, when we talk about online education, whether at a remote place in Nagaland or Arunachal Pradesh or in Jammu Kashmir, are the provisions of internet capabilities available? This question comes to mind because during COVID times, even in cities like Delhi and Mumbai, we see sometimes disruptions occurring. And that's why government is seized of the matter. There is a BharatNet initiative which is taking to all the nooks and corners of the country, including very remote villages. I think that is where empowerment will begin.
Right. I'll take up from Professor Sahasrabudhe when he mentions faculty training. I'll take this question to both Anju ma'am as well as Professor Rajendra Srivastava, whoever wants to go at it first. My question is that however many institutes we open, even if they are premier institutes such as the IITs, IIMs, but the question remains, how can we create a system that generates teachers for these new institutes who are on par with those in your institutes? How do we create this faculty? Anju ma'am, do you want to go first? Ma'am, you're on mute.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this panel with the visionary implications of the NEP. I must say, I believe the plan to be incredibly well articulated. And I would like, before I talk about the need for how we get to doctoral education, to think the to spend a minute about what does the plan accomplish? What is the vision that it lays out? So very broadly speaking, global knowledge superpower, what does that entail? It entails not just teaching, but also a depth of investment in research capabilities. When we think about our educational institutions, these are required to be a combination of learning to develop learning skills as well as research skills. And why is that necessary? Because the creation of new knowledge is at the foundation of helping people learn. The kinds of leaders that we want going into the future are those that have multidisciplinary talents, that have entrepreneurial talents, and most critically linked to the subject matter of this symposium, have the capability for lifelong learning. Because the world is going to change. Any set of knowledge and any set of skills that one acquires in the present time is likely to require a shift as one moves through one's career path. So what does that mean in the context of creating the kinds of teachers and the kinds of educators that facilitate these issues? These are required to be not just knowledgeable in their subject matters, but have the capability to encourage learning by doing. And they are mentors. They're not necessarily teachers in and of themselves, but they are mentors in encouraging ownership of learning on the part of the learner. And that is going to require doctoral education, PhD education of a particular variety, encouraging a linkage between research skills as well as teaching skills, learning by doing in the classroom. This is a tall order, but I must say that we have, India is perfectly capable of doing it. In the IIMs, we have created doctoral programs that develop some of our best teachers, and many of us are fully conversant with the model that this entails. So we should be able to do it. It will require enormous investment.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'll take the question to Professor Rajendra Srivastava. Ms. Seth raised questions about the focus for accelerating innovation, accelerating research. And I think for that also we need to upgrade our faculty. So how do you think you can maintain this balance, Professor Srivastava?
There are plenty of steps. I think it all, excuse me, it starts with governance. The faculty incentives have to be aligned with innovation and creativity and writing. And that's what we're doing at ISP. And it's not very well known, but when it comes to per capita productivity of faculty, ISP is now number 20 in the world. When we look at the productivity, and this is in the leading journals, and we're talking about global journals, Journal of Finance, Operations Management, and so on. What is necessary is also for us to look at our doctoral programs.
Right.
When I was in Singapore, I started a PhD program in general management because many of the problems that are worth solving are not just marketing or finance or accounting or operations. So I started that, and that evolved into a DBA program, which is still running there. And the DBA program at SMU has now about 120 people into that program. We started the equivalent of the DBA program called EFTM, Executive Fellows Program, 3 years ago at ISP. The quality of people that we're getting, and India has a lot of talent, but this is senior managers, the average experience for the latest batch is 24 years. I've got several chief operating officers. I've got 3 CHROs. I've got a chief learning officer. I've got a chief marketing officer. These are the people in the executive fellows program. And I can tell you, we can take this group of people and we can put them up against anybody in the world. Mm-hmm. So India has a lot of talent, and we have a lot of senior managers who are looking for second careers. So we need to not only do the traditional American style PhDs, which we are prone to do, but we really need to look at generating people who can balance theory and practice. And that's what we're doing in part. And so I think there's a big opportunity out here in terms of creating our own people. The West is not going to ask us about Silicon Valley. They're going to ask us what to do about emerging markets. How do you manage growth? How do you manage resilience? And therefore, we have to look at the problems that are worth solving and the opportunities that are worth taking, in our own country first. So let me just stop there.
Absolutely. I'll go to Professor C. Rajkumar. Sir, I have two questions for you. First is the original question that I had for you. That is, the NEP is silent on private participation, really, largely. So that's one question. The second question springs from what Professor Srivastava just mentioned. How do you, the oft repeated complaint against Indian education is that a theory is alienated from its implementation. How do you ensure that the both come together? And how do you ensure that world-class research happens in India? When can India bag perhaps a Nobel in the sciences again?
Well, thank you very much. I want to first of all thank both the Economic Times and upGrad for putting this together.
Yeah.
Suchetana, I think the reality is that let's first start with the fact that the National Education Policy 2020 is a revolutionary, radical, and indeed a truly transformative and progressive vision. There is no doubt about the fact that the people who drafted that had the thoughtfulness, had the farsightedness in reimagining Indian higher education. And almost every aspect of that policy talks about the future. It talks about regulatory reforms. It talks about digitization. It talks about internationalization. It talks about funding for research. It talks about faculty development. In fact, it has talked about everything that needs to be talked about with regard to the future. Now, one of the things that I felt probably should have been covered, at least quite substantially, is the fact that the role of the private sector in relation to higher education. Very unfortunately, with over 70% of Indian higher education institutions in the private sector, and with over 70% of students today studying in private higher education institutions, with the state funding significantly reducing over the years, there is a tectonic shift that has happened in the Indian higher education at least a decade ago. And NEP ought to have had a stronger positioning and presence of it. I do believe that it is not so much that they didn't want to. I think there is enough room for that vision to be captured in the implementation process, because there are some very interesting observations made in the NEP, which actually talks about, removing the barriers and removing historical discrimination associated with the private sector, and private higher education institutions should be measured not on the basis of their origins, but their actual performance. So that room is there for us to overcome. And I do believe that the intention and the objective of the NEP will indeed solve that problem. As far as your second question is concerned, with regard to, you said how do we create a faculty? What was your second question?
My question was about how do you ensure that you maintain balance between theory and its practical application? Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Well, this is one of the most difficult parts in India. Beautiful policies get formulated, but unfortunately, when it comes to implementing, we have a long way to go. And I do believe that right now, there's a fantastic opportunity. The Prime Minister of India has spoken multiple times on the national education policy. We have the education minister convening meetings of vice chancellors and engaging with them. We have the AICTE chairman, the UGC chairman, the NAT chairman. So there is what you call a collective consciousness that has been built around the national education policy for people to galvanize both intellectual consciousness as well as governance consciousness when it comes to how NEP can be implemented. But I will quickly say, I believe 5 things need to be done if you want to have the NEP to be successful. First of all, we need to build trust. Right now, there is widespread distrust with regard to the higher education institutions on one hand, the regulatory bodies on the other, and government agencies as well. We need to build trust, we need to build respect, and we need to build collegiality for NEP to be implemented. Second, we need to focus on transparent decision-making and accountability-based mechanisms for NEP to be implemented at a regulatory side. Third, we need to focus on a lot more autonomy and independence of HEIs themselves. A lot more. And that's already happening. If you look at the graded autonomy policy, if you look at
there are policy interventions to ensure that already.
Institute of Eminence policy. These are all in that process. And the fourth, I would say, is active and participative consultation. And the fifth, I would say, is we need no less than the Prime Minister or the HRD Minister task force, which should be literally be present in the ministry and reviewing and continuously ensuring that the NEP is implemented. If we do all of this, we will be in a good situation towards implementing policy, because many things that NEP wants requires the state government, the central government, the regulatory bodies, including subject-based regulatory bodies, the state education councils. So there are a lot of other things that we need to do. That NEP is implemented.
Right. Professor Rajkumar, what I take away from what you said is that implementation continues to be a concern. We've been speaking to a lot of stakeholders. I'll take that question to Mr. Ramanan. But before that, I'll come to Mr. Narayanan Ramaswamy, sir. Another focus of the NEP has been about access and equity. How can India solve the problem of generating supply of education in the most disadvantaged areas?
Okay, so let me start by thanking Economic Times and AlGrad for this wonderful event. So if you ask me, jumping straight onto the question, access and equity at the school education level has actually been a phenomenal success, if you ask me. Some of the programs that has happened in the past 20 years, if you look at the gross enrollment ratio that is happening in the primary education and secondary education, I think we have had enough success in the access and equity part. The real concern is quality. It's not about accessing that. And in fact, I have seen a lot of, aspirational districts and how we should have an education institution in the aspirational district. My take would be higher education institutions are a destination. There is a difference between how you do school education and how you do higher education. When it comes to school education, you need to reach out to the place where the people live, and you need to have schools in every district kind of stuff, so that primary, secondary education happens. But when it comes to tertiary education, I'm not so sure whether it is prudent to start having educational institutions in every district and every aspirational district, because the capital associated with building this is phenomenal. And I don't think we're going to have budgets to build such kind of institutions. And that is, in that sense, again, I would actually refer to Professor Raj's point. It is the private sector that has been providing access and equity for a lot of time now. And this was, in my view, a golden opportunity to bring about the private sector funding into this. And what are certain subtle things that are happening is, even now educational institutions borrow money from banks and they pay an interest. So it is not as if everything is happening on philanthropy. When you lend money and pay interest, you are actually giving back money. Why is it not that we are allowing equity to come into the education sector? And why is it after a social stock exchange that we don't have private money that can flow into building more educational institutions? So I think one of the big answer to it, which is like a trend that we already see in Indian higher education, is to allow private sector to play a meaningful role. And again, to the point Professor Raj said, remove the skepticism around this. There is genuinely some of the high class, world class, whatever way you put it, students who come out of these institutions. So why don't we allow that to happen? That is one. The second part, to answer your access question, again, I think there was, and there perhaps still is, a golden opportunity, is to truly integrate vocational education with higher education. We have a certain notion about what is vocational education. I work a lot, KPMG and I work a lot in vocational education, and I see the stigma attached with what is called as a vocational education across the country. Now, a pilot is also occasionally trained. A plumber is also occasionally trained. Both of them.
Journalist is also vocationally trained.
Is also occasionally trained. And all I'm saying is, if you are looking at education that is oriented towards a job, what is wrong with that? And I think we need to have such feeder institutions that is going to be more tuned towards direct employment and professional education. Call it vocational, call it professional. And that should coexist with this. NEP definitely talks about integration. It is very good from an overall, at a policy level, at a directional level. I think we need to interpret at NEP, and like Professor Raj and others mentioned, we need to have a forum by which we involve the powers to be, who will make sure the implementation kind of is inclusive, gets the private sector, gets vocational education into this, so that the masses, we are now talking about a huge Indian population that is ready for higher education. This cannot happen just by building more educational institutions in the aspirational districts or more educational institutions per se.
But perhaps that is where upgrad comes in, right? Phalgun, this question is for you. So how can you go really beyond the tier 1, tier 2 cities and reach the vast areas of India, which are truly perhaps underprivileged? You're on mute, Phalgun.
No, absolutely. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that has been the vision for upgrad when we started off. And I think the challenge everybody is aware of that one is access. But when we say access to education, it is not just when we talk in the digital context, providing a recording of a lecture. Right? It is a lot more than that in terms of how can you give high quality education that actually delivers on learning outcomes and career outcomes for people in, as you said, tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 India. And that's where one of the opportunities, and that is something that is really exciting, and I think it's a great moment for us right now, is the opportunity for India to leapfrog some of the existing trends. We have done that on multiple counts. For example, from landline to mobile phones, or from terrestrial broadcasting to satellite broadcasting, where we have a few steps. And I think that is where, when we look at the scale of the challenge in India, we believe that setting up a world-class digital infrastructure to enable learners to achieve their learning outcomes and career outcomes is very exciting, and it's a great opportunity for us right now that we cannot miss. And that's the kind of work that we've been doing in collaboration with some great universities to see how we can work with the faculty, one, create these programs, and then also offer them at scale. And this is not just for formal degrees. Even when you think of working professionals, right? We have about 60-70 million people doing white-collar jobs in India, and all of them over the next 1 or 2 decades will need to continuously learn to remain relevant and make India a very strong and new age economy. And I think that's where this digital infrastructure and making sure that we're able to deliver those world-class learning and career outcomes at scale becomes really important.
Digital infrastructure is a question I'll take to Professor Sahasrabudhe, but before that, Professor Rajkumar raised a question, and I'll bring that to Mr. Ramanathan Ramanan. So there's while the NEP is being hailed as a great vision document, there is some bit of doubt about the implementation. Your thoughts on that, sir? You're on mute, sir. You're on mute.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Suchetana. Yeah, I think it's a very important point that has been brought out, and that is, we have a very good plan on paper. How do you make sure that we implement? And from my perspective, actually, the Honorable Prime Minister, in his clarion call for Atmanirbhar Bharat, really laid down the foundation of implementation of any initiative in India if you really want to have Atmanirbhar education as well as Atmanirbhar Bharat. First and foremost, he said, you have the pillar of the demographic dividend. How do you ensure that the benefits of education and this job enabling education, whether it is in the vocational area or whether it is in the higher order of skills, how do you ensure that our demographic dividend has access and leverage the demographic dividend? Because that's a very important pillar, and that's where the questions of access and equity and all of that come in. The second is the pillar of infrastructure that he mentioned. It is not enough for us to say it is just going to be the digital medium by which we are going to revolutionize education. That is still some way off. How do you ensure that the physical infrastructure as well as the digital infrastructure both are developed? You need the digital highways to be able to reach the remote places of the country. You also need smart infrastructure, smart cities. We have got 8,000 towns and cities in our country, but we have only 8 tier 1 cities. And if you're going to have the best educational institutions only in the 8 tier 1 cities, you're not going to be having a sustainable model of growth. So it is very important for us to be able to implement the necessary infrastructure. In fact, we have enough number of schools, we have enough number of colleges, and we have enough number of universities. That's not the problem. The problem is, do we have world-class infrastructure in each of them, or smart enough infrastructure to deliver quality education? The third is the pillar of demand. The pillar of demand means the focus on vocational skills is as important as the focus on deep tech learning, research, innovation, and so on. You are having 1.3 billion people. And so how do we ensure that the needs and the demands of the 1.3 billion people are met? And that is why it is important to have recognizing vocational education as a very important part, and as important a part as higher education that has been conventionally accepted. And therefore, the ease with which you are able to move people who are going into vocational skills and giving them the option and recognizing it as something that is very important to society and to our country is very
How do
important.
you remove the stigma, which is,
The stigma has been removed by the NEP by saying that, you're giving the options, the various options for people who are having vocational skills training, and they're giving credits to that. And from that, you are able to move on to get a degree. This was missing in our earlier education. So you always got branded as, vocational skill is something which is at a lower level and you cannot advance to a higher skill. But that has been addressed from the point of view of the plan. We have to implement it. And then the pillar of socio-economic growth, which means you cannot let the social divide, the digital divide, be still prevalent. How do you overcome the digital divide? And therefore, affordability of education is very important. You have to make sure that the girl child is also focused on, and they get equal priority. That differently able people who are very talented and who are very innovative, they get a chance. So that equity has to be brought, and so socio-economic good has to be addressed. It is not just economic progress. And finally, the pillar of technology. This is where you have to leverage technology to the hilt. If you don't leverage technology to the hilt, which is becoming affordable, available, accessible, and advanced, and to extend the digital highway to the remotest parts of our country, and you were talking of aspirational districts, the rural India, and so on. In fact, the Atal Innovation Mission and all of these, this is what we are focusing on. The community innovation centers that are being set up across the country are in rural India, tier 2, tier 3 cities, so that they become hubs of learning, innovation, and job creation. Similarly, the incubators that are being set up in universities is giving everybody the opportunity. Every university, world-class university, if they say we are having a world-class university, they should have a world-class incubator, because you are giving the students an opportunity to exercise their innovative capability and convert it into a startup or an entrepreneurial entity, and that is required. And finally, you have to introduce at the school level. So that's why the tinkering labs has been a great implementation from our side, I would say, which has proven itself in the excitement it has created, in the innovative quotient that is being generated in the young students from between grade 6 to grade 12. I mean, give them the empowerment, the tools, and suddenly you're finding amazing innovations. Actually, many of the innovations are available on Google Play Store by young students, grade 6 to grade 12. That is what gets unleashed when you give the opportunity, the exposure, and the empowerment through tools, technology, and access. So that is what I think implementation means, embracing all of this, the 5 pillars that Atmanirbhar Bharat stands for, and thereby ensuring access, equity, affordability, quality, as well as accountability, which is the Honorable Prime Minister has mentioned, are the cornerstone, the critical success factors of your new educational program are these 5 things. And in order to achieve those 5, you have to follow the 5 pillars that you have talked about.
Professor Sahasrabudhe, I have a question for you. It is perhaps slightly away from the NEP. My question is that another thing about education in India is the social obligation. Now, even higher education is highly subsidized in India. My question is, how can we stop the misuse of this subsidized education at premier technical institutes? Should an engineer from, say, an IIT be allowed to then pursue MBA from another premier institute which is also subsidized, and then perhaps go abroad to sell soaps?
I think this is requiring a lot of mindset change. So you cannot make rules for not allowing something to happen, but at the same time, unless the opportunities are visible to students, I think they will not be able to change that tradition which they have been following for quite some time. And recent statistics shows from IIT Delhi, the last couple of batches, not even 5% of the students went abroad actually for taking up jobs. In fact, they all are starting their startups. So that itself is a big change which is happening. They will either do jobs in India or they are doing some startups of their own. I think this mindset change will happen when they find opportunities within the country. As Ramanan rightly pointed out, when Atmanirbhar Bharat takes off in a big way, there are a huge amount of opportunities which will exist. I think that is the call of the time actually. And I think I would like to counter Rajkumar, because he was saying about private entities being not given any place in the new education policy. very categorically it is stated that as far as research funding is concerned, under national research funding, there will be both private as well as government sector will be taken as equal entities or equal partners. I think that's a very big change which is happening. Gradually, even DST, DBT, they have started funding private agencies, but gradually it is increasing in number. So I think new policy will come into that. As far as the regulatory framework is concerned, the policy talks about the regulation will be light but tight, and a single regulatory agency rather than multiple agencies like UGC, AICTE, NCT, and so on and so forth. They're all going to be dissolved by an act of parliament, and a single agency will come up with 4 verticals, one of them doing regulatory work, second one doing funding work, third one doing accreditation work, fourth one will set the standards. So standard setting bodies will be there, which will be taken up by the regulatory body. That is part of the Higher Education Commission of India, an apex body which is going to be created. And therefore, let all the private players who provide 70% of the education be rest assured that the entire process of regulation itself will be based on self-disclosure rather than inspections. And that itself is a big change which is talked about in this policy. But at the same time, the last 2 pillars which Ramanan talked about, the affordability and accountability, I think private sector has to be forewarned about that. They cannot make money out of this. They have to be transparent in their dealings. I think that is where tightness will come from the regulatory body.
Professor Rajkumar, you want to comment on this?
Yes, I appreciate Professor Sahasrabudhe's point of view.
Sure.
The real challenge in India is that how do you make distinction between institutions which are performing even in the private sector with the kind of values of the public sector. The fact remains that we don't have enough resources in the public sector, so there needs to be a larger set of incentives created for private sector to invest in higher education. And I have always believed that we need to focus on a strong not-for-profit philanthropic culture of private sector institutions if we really want to address it. But the point which I still would argue is that we should also not assume that the government and regulation will have answer to all our problems. And that's something which we need to move on. And I do believe that the spirit of what many things that the government is right now doing does recognize that. I want to draw your attention to an absolutely amazing book by an American political scientist, Peter Schuck. And the title of the book is Why Government Fails So Often and What We Need to Do About It. And in which he talks about the 6 aspects in which we need to get public policy right if we want to get regulation right. First, incentives. Second, instruments. Third, information. 4, adaptability. 5, credibility. And 6, management. There is no greater public policy aspect than higher education, in which all these 6 aspects will play very strongly. And that's why I believe we need to have a reimagination of the role of the government and regulators when it comes to higher education. Because frankly, universities are, expected to be responsible institutions.
Yes.
People who are professors who understand how to be able to govern institutions, they need to be given more power and recognized for what they are. This impinges directly on the ideas of academic freedom, institutional autonomy, and independence, all of which has been actually recognized quite strongly in the national education policy. In a way, my point is, let universities decide what they need to do. There is no society in the world where if universities are not given complete autonomy as to what they are, you cannot build a world-class university system. World-class higher education system assumes and presumes that universities need to be autonomous.
Professor Srivastava, you wanted to say something? Yes, please. Very strong words coming in from Mr. Rajkumar. Yes,
no, I agree with Professor Rajkumar. You're right on the money. There are a couple of things that we haven't talked about. One is that we were talking about theory and practice, the bridge between them. And on the practice side, there also needs to be an engagement of the education system with industry. So, we turn out graduates who are not employable, and therefore companies like Infosys have to run Infosys Academy to retrain them. So why can't we have a closer collaboration, experiential learning, if you will, between the academic institutions and the corporate sector.
Mhm.
That's one thing. The second is that if we're going to make progress, we need more competition. And the greater the competition will come from the private sector. We also have to let in foreign institutions because somebody has to bring in the capability and the number of teachers that we need. So there's, if you're going to train, a few million, people to get the demographic dividend, the question is who's going to do it? And in the short run, the greater the amount of competition, the greater the amount of autonomy to the private sector, that is what's going to bring in resources. By the way, on the resource part, there's no shortage. If I'm in Mumbai, and in those days, when you talk to a taxi driver, they were spending 30–40% of their monthly earnings on their children's education. I know middle-class parents who are taking their life savings and spending it on, sending their child to Canada, Australia, or something like that. So there's no shortage of money on behalf of the public to get a good education. So the question is, how are we going to get good education? And one element really is we need more competition in that. We need to loosen the constraints, and we need to go after performance. I love the policy of the self-disclosure.
Yeah.
And it's the public that's going to make a judgment on the quality of education. And one of the things that I learned in Singapore was that the government published statistics on the educational institutions. And so the employment statistics and how well the students were doing, they published the input, the SAT scores and this like that. So if the government will play the role of information disclosure so that students and parents can make the right decision, that's the role they should play, and then let the market take care of issues. So the point that Dr. Rajkumar made about information is absolutely correct.
Yeah.
And the government needs to let the market regulate.
Yes, I'll come to me say it with that. Yesterday in our conversation, you mentioned a very beautiful thought. That is, how can you, the government, as well as the industry collaborate to make NEP effective?
Right. So certainly there's one simple issue of resources. I'm so impressed with the NEP's new research policy that provides research grants to help universities and institutions such as IIM Calcutta progress in a very important and fundamental aspect of helping education produce. But I think that I'm also very impressed with the idea with the light governance. Educational institutions absolutely require autonomy to be able to flourish, but simultaneously, when we talk about information disclosure, what is that information disclosure oriented towards? There must be some standards, and those standards must be worldwide standards, standards that are accepted in a global context for us to be able not only to invite new competition, but also to compete with the players that are, no question about it, going to enter the Indian market. This is a time of opportunity, not just for us who are players in India, but for educational institutions from around the world to make put their feet on the ground and collaborate. So I think one of the important things that the government can do is also to encourage collaborations between players in the Indian market, players from overseas, to be able to leverage the best of the best to take to create the growth that we're seeking. And this is going to inevitably require some degree of e-education, online learning, a learning model which encourages that both the network creation that happens on the ground with students in meeting each other, learning from each other in campuses, but also capitalizing on the opportunities to learn from the best around the world. These are all features that the government can encourage with the autonomy and the light governance.
Right. Thank you, ma'am. We have close to 350 attendees, and there are close to 40 questions that have come in. I have to, before we end this session, I have to take a few questions. This question is for Narayanan Ramaswamy. Question is that engineering institutes are far away from corporate reality. I have spoken to you earlier in the year for a story that I was doing, and you had spoken about the huge catch-up that Indian education has to do. So this question is from Archana Chindarkar, and she's asking, how really can that gap be bridged?
Okay, let me understand the question. If it is as if Indian educational institutions, particularly engineering education, is far away from industry, there are two parts to it. Like if it is the same Indian education from the IITs who are producing some world-class leaders, like who are great engineers, scientists, and others, maybe it's the same education system that has produced engineers who are not even employed. So I think the question is more in terms of how there's no point in talking about a larger curriculum or the larger ecosystem in which it's operating. It is the individual unit and their ability to work closely with the industry that, in my view, is going to be important. And particularly in engineering education, and then connecting to NEP, if it is going to be multidisciplinary, if we are going to have an engineering education that is also going to have shades of how do you survive in the world, not just knowing the theory part of it, the other aspects of it, I think that will help. And second, like I said before, engineering education is not all about the 4-year degree program that we have. That is just one of the ways of doing engineering. There are so many other things that multiple entry and exit that NEP suggests is going to be huge opportunity for us to actually define something that is more industry ready, that is more relevant, and also give the option for students to decide what should they learn and when should they learn. So some of the answers are in NEP, but it's going to largely depend on how the institution is going to look at aligning itself with its objective, aligning with the industry, and making sure that they are relevant for them.
There's a question from Krishna for Phalgun. The question is that when there is such a surge in online education and non-contact education, what is the kind of accountability that should be expected from the platforms such as UpGrad?
I think, thanks a lot for that question. I think we measure ourselves by two standards of accountability. And I think both of them are from an outcome standpoint. The first is learning outcomes. So for us as an education platform, the most important thing is to say that if you're teaching somebody data science, at the end of the course, that person should be a world-class data scientist from a learning outcome standpoint. And I think that's the first accountability that we hold ourselves to. The second part is on career outcomes. So a lot of people talked about how our engineering colleges are disconnected from the corporate world, but how do we make sure that the courses that we are creating, the kind of learning experience that we provide, eventually leads to career outcomes and career acceleration for learners. I think those are the two metrics that I think everybody should be held accountable to make sure that we increase the attractiveness of the entire education system.
There's a question for Professor Sahasrabudhe. The question is that perhaps in the Indian youth is hesitant in taking up vocational skill courses due to the shortage of pay and the culture. How can NEP help overcome that? Yeah.
I've been answering most of the questions. I've already answered some 15, 20 questions here. So I think I'm doing parallel processing here. I think the skill sets which our students have to get it right from school time to when they come to higher education. And in the new policy where we talk about multidisciplinary universities on one side and also having ability to integrate between vocational education and the normal technical education. And one can quit at any stage, after 1 year or 2 years, if they find that they are not suitable for one particular type of task and then get into another one, that is lateral exit and entry into another system. I think these kind of empowerments will make people aware that people who are not fit for engineering may come to vocational education and develop their skills and vice versa. I think that is where in the society gradually diploma in vocation and bachelor of vocation, which are generally taken as something inferior, will also get its own value. And when industry starts appointing such people and get better salaries than engineers, probably the level playing field will be created in due process of time.
There's one more question, that the very last question I'm taking from the audience. And the question I open up to all of you, whoever wants to answer. The question is that NEP is talking about doing away with most of the regulators in the education sector with one umbrella regulator. Does that mean, could that mean that accountability will go down in the education sector, especially say of teachers in the rural areas? Whoever wants to take it. The question
I had already answered that in part earlier, so I think if you want, I can continue. But others, if someone wants to pitch in,
yes, somebody else wants to pitch in.
I would welcome that to happen. Actually,
I think the NEP does provide for accountability, and I don't believe that. And also, we need to understand that accountability is not necessarily driven as a top-down model. Accountability can also be more democratic, more inclusive, more internally engaged, and also, in a university context, it's all about how the recipients of that knowledge and experience value that outcome as well. So I think it's very important that we should be very conscious of not applying the principles of accountability in a corporation or a business enterprise and the way it functions to how a university functions. Universities function in a completely different framework when it comes to accountability.
I think I want to tell a simple anecdote which Prime Minister Modi ji himself said in one of the meetings, that in the schools, we find that in rural schools, the actual teachers who are appointed, they don't go at all. They outsource people. And therefore, he said every school should be asked to put up the large photographs of the teachers into the school so that they know who are the teachers appointed. Maybe the photograph which is bigger than the Prime Minister or President of India, so that they one side feel elated that they are bigger than the Prime Minister, and on the other side students will know who is the teacher, who is not a teacher, who is coming to class is not a teacher.
Ms. Seth, you want to
Yes, this actually picks up on both of the points made previously. Accountability must be accompanied by transparency of information. So going to Professor Sahasrabudhe point, the idea that there are large photographs of the notional teachers will help with that transparency. So these are two sides of the same coin. We have to have transparency. We have to have information symmetry so that our audiences understand what it is that they're expected to gain and learn. We are able to gain whatever whatever is being promised. So I think that the new educational policy stresses both of these points, the transparency as well as the accountability. I think the governance practices going forward for the regulators is to how to put that into place, because it's not an easy act to accomplish, but all power to the policy to make it happen.
Absolutely.
If I may just add, yeah. I think when we talk of accountability and all of that, at the end of the day, it is the young student who is out there who is going to feel the results of this accountability. And therefore, it is very important for educational institutions to hold themselves accountable to three things. One, are they inspiring a culture of learning in the students? Are they inspiring a culture of problem solving, innovative thinking? Are they inspiring them to become not just a job seeker, but to be able to realize their full potential as in whatever area of interest that they have? So that is one part. The second part of accountability is the enablement. Are you enabling this? You may be inspiring them, but are you enabling them through the ecosystem, through the teachers, through the mentors, through the Gurukul that you talked about right in the beginning? How are you enabling this ecosystem in terms of access to quality infrastructure, quality education, quality training, quality teachers, remote mentoring, so on and so forth. The third is the accountability in terms of implementation. How are you ensuring that you are actually implementing the schemes that the NEP is talking about in theory and making it real in practice? So there has to be accountability there. When you are saying that, for example, I'm going to give equal voice and equal importance to vocational training, which is very important in our country. There was discussion on autonomy for private sector. World-class institutions can only happen if you make them fully autonomous. That is true, but that is not going to be possible in the near future for our 8,000 tier 2, tier 3 towns and cities, our 600,000 villages, our 715 districts, out of which 115 are aspirational districts. The government will have to play a role in all of this. If you are thinking by some magical wave of a wand, you're going to create an autonomous ecosystem of universities in these places where you have to pay. I mean, if you have to get into the top class institutes in India, an ISB or IIM or whatever, it costs a lot. It's not easily affordable, and rightly so, because they are trying to give world class education, and world class education requires world class infrastructure. But in the meantime, how do you deal with the 1.3 billion people and 150 million young students out there? So you have to have a practical combination of accountability. Government money and funding comes, how do you become accountable, and how do you ensure that the implementation of the intent behind that is happening? Then you have true accountability, and that is what is going to result in a world-class educational system.
I have completely run out of time, but I'll take quick, I think there is a quick points that, Professor Rajkumar.
I want to quickly respond to one thing, that we do recognize the demographic diversity, but we should be very clear, our aspiration should match with what we do. So we can't say, oh, we want to build world-class universities, we want to be in the top 100 in the world, and then constantly not take efforts that are needed. In fact, our Prime Minister understands this very well. When he talked about the ease of doing business rankings, we need to play. If you want to be part of these things, you then recognize that this is the global competition. So you either decide we don't want to be part of rankings, we don't want to be part of the top 100, and we handle what we have to deal with. But if you want to be part of the top 100, then we do exactly what those top universities around the world do to be part of that.
Okay, I'll go to Narayanan before I come to Professor Srivastava. Yes, please, quickly.
So my quick take is on the regulator. Multiple regulators doesn't mean better compliance. Multiple regulator only means more work and those who comply. To me, making the regulations simpler and easy to comply and make it difficult for people who don't comply to survive will be the mantra. So having more regulators does not help at all.
Right. Okay, Professor Srivastava.
So I really want to emphasize capability building. I'm talking about faculty and teachers. And I also want to put in a plug-in for upgrad. India is not the United States. We don't have 6,000 universities trying to fight, a legacy system that's trying to fight change. We have quite a few million youngsters that need to be trained. So while we can dream about the IITs and the IIMs and the ISBs, a lot of people need training. And, we've seen it in cell phones. India will use leapfrogging. And I think, we need to invest in the technology, but we also need to invest in the content. So just the technology by itself isn't going to do it. And so we need to rethink. It's not a good idea to simply follow the West. We need to look at what are the needs of India. And I think we're going to need quality, but we're also going to need scale. And the scale will come from technology, which is being resisted in the West. All the universities that are trying to go out of business, they're working hard at trying to resist the upgrads of the West. So
Point taken, Professor Srivastava. Point taken. Lessons from the West, lessons from the best university, but indigenization is perhaps the key word, right?
And scale. We need scale, We really, really need to educate millions and not thousands.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to add to that, I think I completely agree with Professor Srivastava, and that's where we said that the next global world-class edtech solution is going to come from India and not from the US or Europe, because I think the need in India...
Because the demand is here in India.
Yeah, the scale, the need in India is disproportionately large, and I think that innovation is something that we need to build towards, and I think that's the vision that we want.
Absolutely. We've completely run out of time. Thank you very much once again for joining this panel. It's been an invigorating panel to begin this summit with. With that, I will hand over the baton to my colleague Alokesh Bhattacharya for the next panel. Alokesh.
Thank you, Suchetana.
Thank you all of you.
Thank you. Take care.